this question about really, and it isn't really there, gets into the question of, again, unity and multiplicity. Now, people in our culture are not going to say this lock isn't here, but there might be elements of this lock that aren't salient to them. Now, think about a lot of what Peterson has said about when we see this lock. Peterson says we see the meaning of the lock we see the meaning of the lock before we see the object, which is the lock. And so, for example, if this lock is on the gate over here at Living Stones, then we're going to see a locked gate, and that's going to mean for us a barrier to entry, or if you're on the inside, it might mean that the church is locked when I'm leaving it at night, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the object that is the lock is not exactly what we think it is in terms of the history of, let's say, reductive materialism, and these two are going to get into that.
Mm-hmm. But I'm old-fashioned, and I think an apple is an apple.
I do too, and I think that, and this is where I really like. I'm going to bring Persic into it again because this is what the way of understanding that makes most sense for me. Because I'll tell you, a lot of the complexities that these guys talk about is beyond me. You know, like I can't understand it on that high level. I have to understand it on a simpler level, and this is what Persic does for me. Mm-hmm. And what he's saying is that these societal rules that we have, they are actual entities in themselves. They're patterns. They're static patterns of value, but they're on a certain level. They're on a social level. So these, while they exist as actual entities, you know, in sort of the subjective realm, let's just say, they can't be measured like, you know, like a molecule. They can't be measured as a material entity because they're not. Mm-hmm. But they are, they are evolved from the same source that created material entities. And this is, you know, so his theory encompasses all of reality as static patterns. They just happen to be patterns of value that occur within the social strata. And the social strata is actually something that has evolved out of or emerged from, really. The emergence is a much better way to understand it than evolution. Although, you know, you could say they're very similar. Mm-hmm. So the social pattern emerges out of the biological patterns, which emerge out of the inorganic patterns. So that means that there's a direct relationship between them and molecules at the lowest level. And that's how, you know, that Persic's theory can encompass all of perceived reality and, you know, all of reality.
Now, at this point, the conversation gets interesting because Christians will often start to feel a little bit pinched because Christians are going to feel a little bit pinched because it sort of makes reality sound simply like an emergent property, and this property of it's phrased in our society like social construct. Now, that's an interesting conversation going on. Gender is a social construct. Race is a social construct. You know, all of these things are social construct. And you might ask, well, why do people get so excited about that in terms of, let's say, opposition or opportunity? Obstacle or opportunity. Well, people think, well, if it's a social construct, then we can change it. Then we can get rid of racism. And now there's they have a point in there that, for example, racism as a public reality has changed quite significantly since, let's say, I was born in the 1960s. And you might say, oh, wow, race has changed and race relations are better. And in many ways, they are very much better for a good number of people. It doesn't mean racism has gone away necessarily, but I think few people would, well, there are people, but many would argue, and I would argue, that racism is actually a better thing. Say, oh, well, if it's merely a social construct, if it's merely intersubjective, then if we all come to agreement, then we can change an intersubjective negative thing into a positive thing. And that's an absolutely fine thing. Part of the reason Christians get nervous is because, well, of course, they've got some axioms about belief in God and all of these things, and nobody likes getting kicked in their axioms or having their axioms sort of shaken. But another piece of it is the fact that, well, then suddenly reality is arbitrary. And if there's something, you know, if there's a significant thing that Jonathan and Matthew Peugeot have done with their symbolism work, and I think this is a central piece of Jordan Peterson's work, it's the assertion that creation, that the world around us is not arbitrary, that in fact these things are going in a direction. And this is a big undertone between, let's say, a lot of the Christians and non-Christians in this little corner when we talk about these things. And I think a big part of John Vervaeke's interest in exploration in Neoplatonism is also on the non-arbitrary side of things. And I think a huge part of Jordan Peterson's interest in exploration has been on the non-arbitrary side of things. Now, things being non-arbitrary, is on one hand gives us an excitement about opportunity because, well, if it's non-arbitrary, then we can have some engagement, order, and predictability to the world, which we very much desire. But if it's non-arbitrary, that also means that there are limits on the degree to which we can impact the social imaginary, the degree to which we can, let's say, eliminate racism, the degree to which we can, let's say, blur the lines between male and female, if that is what you want to do. There are limits on a lot of the sort of heady utopian pursuits that people might want to follow because, well, these constructs are not arbitrary. They are, in fact, pursuing something. They are following something. They are heading somewhere. And so when we get to Sam and John Vervaeke and some of the conversations about evolution, or at least process and change within biological species, process and change within, let's say, these immaterial social existences, the language that we talk about them when we talk about them as spirits or principalities, or some people like to use the word egregore, and John and Jonathan had a good conversation about that. That's where all of this sort of comes to play and really gets a lot of attention in this little corner.
Is because you don't get social values until you get something that evolves from, whatever creature came up on the shore from the water, but that those things are entities as much as the creature that came up from the water, if that makes any sense.
Well, let me read you what was in the Andrew Klavan article, and then tell me how that, if it fits with what you're saying.
Oh, and one thing I want to say is this is going to sound like it is just strict material, scientific materialism, but all the while you have to, realize that in Persick's work is a godlike force called quality.
And see, now this is going to get interesting because the question of person comes to the fore. And Luke, in a comment in today's video, I'll just show the video he wants me to talk about. Hey, wait a minute. Nate made a clip. Here's the main conversation
that it is
where John Vervaeke and Jordan Daniel Wood really dig down into the question of personhood. And when Sevilla is sort of dealing with Karen on this is the question: is God a personal God? What do we mean by person? And I do have a few things to say about this conversation. It's not an easy conversation. It's nearly 2 hours long, and most of the middle of it is, I used the word esoteric before. It really wasn't a fair word, and Nate Heil challenged me on that, and rightly so. But it was a very abstract and conversation that I think a lot of people will feel is just sort of above them. But even when we use the word like that, above them, as Peugeot tagged Brett Weinstein on now 5 years ago, why did you use above? That's not arbitrary either.
Mm-hmm.
That is driving these things to happen, that it's just not random spontaneity. There's something that is toward the good, propelled by the good, that is causing these things to happen. So it's not just strictly material evolutionary theory.
Right. There's a telos involved.
There's
right?
a telos, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Well, in Andrew Klavan's article, he's saying that Yuval Harari sort of insists that religion, nationhood, money, law, and human rights are just intersubjective phenomena existing in the shared imaginations of millions of people. That they are fictions. That's Harari's word.
And there again, so when we use a word like fiction, okay, so a story that doesn't have a high degree of a very specific physical correspondence to it. Lord of the Rings. You're not gonna hunt around the United Kingdom and find Mordor. You might find the Shire in a little village, or you might find the Shire in an out-of-the-way place in New Zealand. But, on and on and on and on with this. And so fiction, and that gets, now there's an old reason why that gets Christians nervous, because in a sense, part of what happened with the modernist fundamentalist fight was it said, well, the Bible is a fiction. So when Jordan Peterson says the fiction, cosmic skeptic, that triggers him and says, aha, Jordan Peterson doesn't believe the Bible is true. But of course, there's lots of nested things in there, because Cosmic Skeptic has an idea of what he means by true. Jordan Peterson has an idea about what he means by true. And there's certainly some overlap in their Venn diagrams, but it's not exactly the same. And so Karen is dealing with this question of fiction.
Harari says, none of these things exist outside the stories that people invent and tell one another. There are no gods in the universe, no nations, no money, no human rights, no laws, and no justice outside the common imagination of human beings. And Klavan goes on to say, that's not how fiction works. Good fiction does not create phenomena, it describes them. So it can't be a fiction because it's being described because it's actually there.
And this, of course, was exactly the point that Peterson was making in his video, that when he says again and again, fiction can be more real than, well, than what? Than description, let's say. Because fiction can illuminate and point out and refer to the pattern, whereas, let's say, a more descriptive narrative might be an instantiation of the pattern, but it is pointing to the instantiation more than it is pointing to the pattern. And in that way, fiction can be more real because, in a certain sense, the pattern and the instantiation have an interesting relationship when we use the word real. Now I'm in danger of being of having some of the same challenges that the John Vervaeke, Jordan Daniel Wood conversation had, but this is what they're talking about.
To me, that's kind of the whole problem with even when I hear Peterson and Douglas Murray and Ian McGilchrist and all of them, I love listening to them. They have ways of talking about it that are just great. But it almost seems to me that they're unknowingly nourishing a view of the world in which that actuality is no longer there. Yeah. We've just found a nicer way to talk about the fiction. Yeah. That we're going to act as if we're going to have a religion that's not a religion, or something that's going to hold society together. But if it's just a fiction, it's not going to last very long.
And I think this is exactly where a lot of this disquiet comes from, because, well, a fiction is sort of a made-up story that's not going to last very long. Now, obviously, if the fiction is pointing to a pattern, the fiction will be more enduring and there'll be a lot more interest in it than necessarily particular instantiations of it. For example, if you tell a story about a family with an alcoholic father, that might not be of interest to very many people because you might not know about the family, you might not care about the family. But just the way that I phrased it, a family about an alcoholic father, now suddenly millions of people who have experienced alcoholic fathers suddenly perk up and pay interest. So in that sense, the fiction about the story of the alcoholic father is more powerful than an instantiation of a story if, and this is the big question, it's some other family that you're not connected with or it doesn't have anything germane to you. In other words, if the alcoholism of, let's say, Fulano down the road has no connection with you, then you don't care. But if Fulano got in his car when he was drunk and he killed a member of your family, now suddenly the alcoholic named Fulano is of great interest to you and is more real than just the story, a fictional story of an alcoholic named Fulano who who was drunk driving. So it's that kind of complexity that we're dealing with here.
And Harari can be the nicest guy in the world, but
they say he's not.
Well, even if he were, someone who says that there are no gods, there are no nations, no money, no human rights, no laws, and no justice outside the common imagination. When the common imagination shifts, what the heck is going to happen, right? I mean, I suppose Yuval Harari then is the one that's going to tell us how to do things.
That's right. No, I get exactly what you're saying.
And again, Karen's anxiety is coming from the same source that, let's say, the excitement of some trying to say, well, all these things are social constructs. So if we can get enough agreement among people, we can change the social construct. And of course, democracy has a piece of this, because democracy is based on, well, if the will of the majority believes something, then we can instantiate that into law. Now, that doesn't mean that the rest of creation is going to go along with it. And when people instantiate things into law that run afoul of certain very real patterns in reality, in time, those laws tend to bring negative consequences, so on and so forth. But this is what Karen is talking about.
Because at the bottom of it, including Peterson, they're having a really hard time. I mean, both Peterson and John Vervaeke, because to go in the direction that you're implying, they would have to kind of somehow agree that there's a God, right? Mm-hmm. And that's why I think, and I'm not going to go on and on about Pirsig, I've done plenty of that, but I think that Pirsig is compatible with believing there's a God. Not necessarily, that can work. He can work in his theory can work in Christianity, and his theory can work in Buddhism. Mm-hmm. But there has to be the sensibility that it isn't something random that starts with particles. And that's the problem, that if you don't somehow see something like God or something like quality as the ultimate force in the universe before this duality that happens, the separation of heaven and earth, then you're going to end up with, with a particle, right? You're going
Now again, see the anxiety beneath the surface and what Sevilla's addressing. Now Sevilla is saying no, but it can't be arbitrary, it can't be random, because if it is arbitrary and it is random, well, basically I think then you have one of the critical ingredients to the meaning crisis when you say that the world has laid itself out in an arbitrary fashion. You might get excited because social constructs can be re-engineered by democracy and agreement and maybe propaganda and all sorts of ways of trying to change other human beings' mind because things are intersubjective. And then, of course, along comes John Vervaeke and Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Peugeot, and they say, it doesn't really look random. It doesn't really look arbitrary. There seem to be enduring patterns that are connected in ways that are not material and are enduring, and in fact our recognition and participation in these patterns seem vital for the creation of healthy societies and cultures as we go through time. Okay, and then you're sort of back into, let's say, a classical mindset, but you might not be knocking on the door of full-fledged theism. And I think beneath a lot of these conversations is in fact this anxiety, especially among theists, that, well, part of it is just, I'm a theist and I want other people to be theists because it's actually connected to that same agenda of the social imaginary, that, well, if we can have more people believe that they're theists and we can have some agreement about what this God is and who this God is, well then, but now here in late modernity, the end of modernity, there's still not a letting go of this idea that, well, God is impersonal. God is a force. Now, Karen's going to talk about this, and I really like the way that she sort of counters it. And this very much gets into, the conversation that I had with John Vervaeke a while ago about sort of the modes that we operate in. And this, in fact, does get into this question of participation and person here, because I think that the proper mode of dealing with that which is both moreness and suchness, and that which is beyond what we can comprehend or manage, is in fact the mode that we use in relating to persons. It is Pascal's a spirit of finesse rather than a spirit of geometry. And once we're dealing with realities such as persons, the spirit of finesse is in fact the proper mode to deal in, and we should deal with that in a personal way. We should act as if the being, the language is tough with this stuff. We should act as if that with which we engage is personal rather than impersonal. But this is in many ways the major contention of the Enlightenment and modernity, because a big part of that project was to disenchant, depersonalize via the scientific method, so that very small and sometimes interconnected and complex dynamics could be engaged. We could engage with them in order to achieve particular outcomes that we desire. Boy, this is a thinky-talky video.
to end up with something that at the bottom is inorganic.
Well, let's take that.
And then you're going to end up with, somehow see something like God or something like quality as the ultimate force in the universe before this duality that happens, the separation of heaven and earth. Then you're going to end up with, with a particle, right? You're going to end up with something that at the bottom is inorganic.
Well, let's take that picture and move over to organics for a second. Let's take a human being, since we're so simple to talk about. When, or any multicellular organism, which Michael Levin is always talking about, his idea is that human beings are just an amalgam of all these various multicellular communities that came together accidentally, in evolution to eventually group up in various groupings and ended up being a human being, and that we are a community of communities. Which
and you can hear in some ways the anxiety in Karen that what word that these evolved accidentally, randomly, arbitrarily.
I mean, I can understand. It's a very useful picture because we have.
Who did you say again?
This is Michael Levin.
Okay.
Yeah. That we're a community of communities. My heart is a community of cells that is working towards a certain project, and my lungs is a community of cells, and my blood is a certain other kind of cell, and then the bacteria that live in me are another community, and that somehow all those different communities came together to make an organism, starting with the simplest ones, obviously, and then moving up through evolutionary process. But nevertheless, a human being.
Now this does get into, sort of the Peugeotian observation that, okay, well, this is a lock, but the lock is made of the shank, it's made of the housing, it's made of the mechanism, but we see it as a one thing, we see it as a lock. Now, of course, the community of interconnected cellular organisms and structures that make up this physical being sitting in front of this camera here that the light can very easily capture as a distinct person, yeah, there's multiplicity and uniqueness. And again, I can put this lock on the gate, and now suddenly the lock disappears and it becomes a locked gate. Now, if we want to unlock the gate, suddenly the lock appears. And so again, you have the many and the one, the many and the one.
Does arise from a unity,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's a gamete that's formed when a sperm and an ovum come together.
Yeah.
And that unity is what creates a human being. That unity then springs into this amazing multiplicity, which all seems to have a direction and a goal and a telos and a quality that every one of these multicellular groupings, like Levins talks about this, he even uses this language that when they go to build an arm, they signal to each other where to build that arm and how long the arm is supposed to be and when they're supposed to stop when the arm is the right length. And so obviously they're striving towards a pattern of quality that is somewhere in that cell. It's not in the DNA, though. The pattern of quality is not in the DNA. So, so you have this unity arising into this multiplicity, but then even though I am a multiplicity, I am a unity. And my unity will join with another unity. I mean, long ago, it joined with another unity, and the two of us made another unity that sprang into a multiplicity. So you can't, if you dissect a human person down into its individual cells, its individual components, you've got nothing.
Yeah.
Unless you're starting with the individual unity that starts at the beginning of a human being.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right.
On the other hand, it seems that every cell in the human body carries all the information for the body, which is like completely unbelievable, you know?
I know, isn't it?
Yeah. And not just the DNA, but lots of other information besides.
And you can watch a lot of Karen's conversations with Michael Levin. It's really fascinating conversations.
And in fact, I think he said, Levin said something one time that in the mucosa or in your spit, that actually they're going to come to a place that they'll be able to diagnose anything that's going on in your body just by looking at the spit.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So that's going to be something.
Yeah.
Well, shall we move on to the next little clip?
Yeah. Oh, and one thing I wanted to say though that just occurred to me is, and this is why I think that, you know, John Vervaeke is going so much in the direction of Neoplatonism, that the one he's talking about is the Neoplatonist one, Plotinus, which is, you know, and the thing is in Pajot, I think, has a very similar conception. Like the way Pajot has described God and the way Plotinus describes God are very similar. You know, they're not anthropomorphic in any way. They are this force, this force of creation and good is the best way I can arrive at it. So it's something that's beyond all comprehension, but we know that it's a creative force for the good. Is that your understanding of his?
Yes, but I think there's this proviso that I would make, and I think that I'm on the same page with Jonathan, and that is that when we interact with, if we can interact with God at all, we're interacting with God as one of the persons of the Trinity, either the Father or the Son or the Holy Spirit, and that is the way that God has manifested himself to man so that we can interact with him, so that because he's so far above and beyond anything that we could ever imagine,
understand it.
that we can't comprehend, we can't interact.
Yeah, totally inaccessible, right?
So God manifests himself in three persons. So he is a personal God. So the New Age type people will think about God as a force, okay? But if he is just a force, then a force is something that you can manipulate. You can plug yourself into it. You can power from this force. But that's not the way God chose to manifest himself to us. He chose to manifest himself to us as a person, a personal God, you know, the Son who incarnated into the world for a purpose, and the Father and the Holy Spirit who dwells within us. That's our relational connection to God, is with a person.
Now, this is a really key point that Karen makes, and it's actually a point that C.S. Lewis made in his book, Miracles. Let us now apply this to the savage or primitive articles of the Christian creed, and let us admit at once that many Christians, though by no means all, when they have made assertions, do have in mind just those crude mental pictures which so horrify the skeptic. When they said that Christ came down from heaven, they do not have a vague image of something shooting or floating downwards out of the they do have a vague image of someone shooting or floating downwards out of the sky. When they say that Christ is the Son of the Father, they may have a picture of two human forms, one looking rather older than the other. And we now know that the mere presence of these mental pictures does not of itself tell us anything about the reasonableness or absurdity of the thoughts they accompany. If absurd images meant absurd thought, then we should all be thinking nonsense all the time. And the Christians themselves have made it clear that the images are not to be identified with the thing believed, hence the commandment of graven images. And not representing God as things within the creation. Now, there's a difficulty in there, because in order for us to, as Karen said, relate to this God, in many ways we do have to work through analogy. And so Father and Son is of course an analogy, or God and Israel as husband and wife. You can find that in the Old Testament. They may picture the Father as a human form, but they also maintain that he has no body. They may picture him older than the Son, but they also maintain that one did not exist before the other, both having existed from all eternity. I am speaking, of course, about Christian adults. Christianity is not to be judged from the fancies of children any more than medicine from the ideas of the little girl who believed in horrid red things. And you can read about that in the book. At this stage, I must turn aside with a rather simple-minded illusion. We can point out that what the Christian means is not to be identified with their mental pictures. Some people say, in that case, would it not be better to get rid of the mental pictures and of the language which suggests them altogether? This is exactly the kinds of issues we're dealing with in this little corner of the internet when we're exploring, as Sevilla and Karen are doing, as John Vervaeke and Jordan Daniel Wood were doing. We're trying to explore what we mean by this, and sometimes the language gets very abstract, and we have all these tiny little differences and implications and nuances which we're trying to tease out with all of this thinky-talky stuff. In many ways, the pictures cut through, even if they are imprecise in some aspects, which is why we're always sort of making new analogies, going back and forth between the pictures, so on and so forth. The people who recommend it have not noticed that when they try to get rid of man-like, or let's say personal, or as they called anthropomorphic images, they merely succeed in substituting images of another kind. I don't believe in a personal God, says one, but I do believe in a great spiritual force. What he has not noticed is that the word force has let in all sorts of images about wind and tides and electricity and gravity. I don't believe in a personal God, says another, but I do believe we are all parts of one great being which moves and works through us all, not noticing that he has merely exchanged the image of a fatherly and royal-looking man for the image of some widely extended gas or fluid. A girl I knew was brought up by higher-thinking parents to regard God as perfect substance. In later life, she realized that this had actually led her to think of him as something like a vast tapioca pudding. To make matters worse, she disliked tapioca. We may feel ourselves quite safe from this degree of absurdity, but we are mistaken. If a man watches his own mind, I believe he will find that what profess to be specially advanced or philosophic conceptions of God are, in his thinking, always accompanied by vague images which, if inspected, would turn out to be even more absurd than the man-like images aroused by Christian theology. For man, after all, is the highest of things we meet in sensuous experience. He has at least conquered the globe, honored though not followed virtue, achieved knowledge, made poetry, music, and art. If God exists at all, it is not unreasonable to suppose that we are less unlike him than anything else we know. No doubt we are unable to speak differently. No doubt we are unspeakably different from him. To that extent, all human-like images are false. But those images of shapeless mists and irrational forces which, unacknowledged, haunt the mind when we think we are rising to the conception of impersonal and absolute being, must be very much more so. For images of one kind or another will come. We cannot jump off our own shadow. And he goes on from there. And I think that's actually terrifically important in this conversation and many of our conversations, because part of what Christians will generally assert is that, and you'll obviously find Peugeot in this camp, Peugeot, who regularly admonishes his followers to go to church, because the proper mode of relating is going to involve images, personal images. Now, one colleague of mine in the Christian Reformed Church has often noted that even in an iconoclastic tradition like the Christian Reformed Church, we do not rid ourselves of mental images. And this is the point that C.S. Lewis is making. And Lewis is partially making the point because people would like to say, well, these instantiations are insufficient to deal with the known vastness of what even Christians agree is God, beyond our comprehension, etc., etc. Lewis's point is that if we always simply switch to impersonal metaphors, you get right back to Karen's point that, well, here's the funny thing with forces. Part of the reason that we really like talking about forces within the scientific revolution was we can, as persons, manipulate a force, use a force, employ a force, wield a force. If you watch any of the Star Wars movies, well, guess what? Use the force, Luke. And part of what is foundational to Christianity, and I think the other Abraham religions as well, is that God is not a force that we can wield. And Tolkien, of course, gets at this in a tiny little picture in terms of the ring is not a implement that Boromir can wield. Now, of course, the ring is evil, and that's a different point. But the point is that we are and are not able to wield things because we are small. And idolatry, by definition, is our attempt to wield God, usually by manipulating things that are, in fact, beneath us within the created order, things that have been put beneath us by God within the created order. And when we try to use these things below in order to wield that which is above, it is, in fact, idolatry, and it is deadly, and it is offensive, and we ought not to do it. But that then leads us into, well, what mode of apprehension and communication should we use when attempting to engage with God and relate to God? And I would argue that, in fact, as Lewis pointed out, the personal is best.